boatload of miseries, pain and death.
Only 8 men survived from the San Emiliano's crew of 40. To Allied seamen, the U-boat crews were heartless killers. But the Germans were brave men, too. They needed all their courage when depth charges exploded round them, sometimes for 12 hours at a stretch. 8 of every 10 U-boat crewmen were to die in action. They called their U-boats iron coffins.
The destroyer I met had radar, so he had me on his screen, and with full speed ahead, he rammed me for the first time. And when I saw him, it was too late to dive. I tried to torpedo him, but the distance, 150 yards roundabout, was too close, so the torpedo wouldn't explode. So I tried to get to have a bigger distance between the destroyer and the boat. And he was shooting during 1 hour or 2 hours with machine guns. An officer next me was dead, and another officer, he had got a bullet through his throat, and I had got a bullet in my chest, and I had some 30 shell splinters in arm and leg, and a bullet in my head. After 1 hour stress, the sailors were very anxious. And one of the petty officers, he lost his nerves and said, "Oh, this madman, and why don't we surrender?" But this was the only one.
But the time was coming when courage was no longer enough. Radio had remained essential to Wolfpack operations, but new Allied direction-finding equipment could pick up German signals and plot where they came from.
Submarine, all right, sir.
With shortwave radar, escorts could now locate a U-boat on the surface, often sighting the U-boat before her crew could see them. The low silhouette was no longer such an advantage. Aztec equipment too was improving. Escort ships could track a submerged U-boat as she twisted and turned at low underwater speed. There were new weapons like the Hedgehog for the kill. The Germans did not realize the extent of British and American technical advances, nor did they match them.
The Germans had some very high-class scientists indeed, and some excellent engineers, but they didn't achieve the results they ought to have done. First, I think, because they were mucked around, and the Germans kept altering the priorities. And secondly, and most important, so I don't believe they were ever allowed to take any interest in the operational side, as opposed to what happened with us, where the scientists were made to feel full members of the operational team. And I believe this, much more than the question of weapons and devices, was the reason why the Germans fell so far astern in technological matters.
The Allies themselves were still behind in using what was to prove the most effective counter to the U-boat: aircraft with radar. convoys could seldom be given continuous long-range air cover. When they were, losses were reduced and U-boat kills increased. The problem was range. Planes now flew to the convoys from North America, from Iceland, from the United Kingdom. But there was a vast gap in mid-Atlantic which these escort planes could not reach. The U-boats could and did. In the second half of 1942, over 3.5 million tons went down, nearly 700 ships, many of them in the Atlantic Gap. To close this gap, escort carriers were needed to sail with the convoys. But few were yet available. Or very long-range planes like the Liberator. But in 1942, the Americans needed most of these in the Pacific. Or Lancaster bombers. But despite Admiralty appeals, the RAF kept them all bombing Germany, although they did release other aircraft.
Bomber Command diverted 6 squadrons to Coastal Command. And if you'd said it would have been better if they'd made that 10, yes, it would. But the line had to be drawn somewhere. And as a coastal type, I would like to have seen a few more squadrons in coastal. But Bomber Command were pitifully short of airplanes too, for the job they had to do. Surely, if there had been more Liberators allocated from America, then we could have improved the situation much earlier and have saved the lives of a lot of seamen.
More and more, the war effort depended on the United States. Merchant ships and escorts were mass-produced to carry the material and men for the invasion of Europe. Unless the Atlantic was secured, all else could fall apart. In January 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill decreed that the defeat of the U-boat be given top priority. Improved escort vessels were built. There were now enough of these to go over to the attack. But also in January 1943, Dönitz took over as chief of the German Navy. He paid off most of the big ships and released their crews for the submarine service. At last he could have U-boats mass-produced. 17 new U-boats were commissioned each month. By early spring 1943, Dönitz had over 400 U-boats in service. Once again, the convoys might be overwhelmed. In May came what was to prove the decisive battle around convoy ONS-5.
ONS-5 was a rather small, very slow, and of course unladen, empty convoy. And we had a lot of trouble. The weather was very bad, the ships got disorganized, and south of Iceland, after 3 or 4 days, we had several attacks by submarines, most of which we drove off successfully, and only had 1 ship sunk. Then after a spell, we had a long series of very bad gales indeed, combined with a little nip into the ice pack off Greenland. And at this stage, my ship was running short of fuel. I couldn't fuel from the tanker because of the weather, and I had to leave.
I got the signal from Breton that he had to push off to Newfoundland to get fuel, and would I come back and take over the escort? I didn't say would I, I said, you're in charge.
May the 3rd. 4 escort ships have left to refuel. In bad weather, 10 merchant ships have lost contact. A line of U-boats is waiting. As they move in on the 4th of May, aircraft from Canada sink one and damage another.
at about 4:30 to 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the torpedoing started.
Well, I torpedoed 2 ships, each with 2 torpedoes, and one of these ships, well, it didn't explode, but after the explosion of the torpedoes, another big explosion happened.
I looked back and I saw the captain. I would suggest the bridge was probably 10 or 15 feet, might be a little more off the water, when he jumped off the wing of the bridge into the sea. And there was a life raft nearby, I know that. Well, I couldn't stop and pick him up. And, well, it was in, I suppose a matter of half a minute that I got one.
They called their U-boats iron coffins.
The destroyer I met had radar, so he had me on his screen, and with full speed ahead, he rammed me for the first time. And when I saw him, it was too late to dive. I
Out loud of miseries, pain, and death.
Only 8 men survived from the San Emiliano's crew of 40. To Allied seamen, the U-boat crews were heartless killers. But the Germans were brave men, too. They needed all their courage when depth charges exploded round them, sometimes for 12 hours at a stretch. 8 of every 10 U-boat crewmen were to die in action.